Hey guys, I'm just going to put it out there. I don't like drinking milk. In fact, most adults don't. But we Americans sure do love other dairy products. I mean, just walk down the freezer section in your grocery store. It's full of ice cream. If you go to the gym, everybody seems to be drinking those protein shakes. Have you ever leaned into mac and cheese for comfort food? And do you know a single college student who thinks that life would be worth living without pizza? So yes, we consume a lot of dairy, even if we don't drink milk. I'm SHERYL Fox, and I'm a registered dietitian. I'm also an ex-biochemist. So although I no longer work in the field of biochemistry, I retain that deep curiosity about how our bodies utilize the food that we consume. Milk is the most complex food on the planet. And so I want to spend some time today and kind of dig into the macronutrients of milk so that you have a better understanding about what's in those products that we consume so much. So this will take us into the topics of proteins, which means I'm going to discuss A1 versus A2 milk. We'll talk about the carbohydrates in milk, which means I want to spend some time talking about lactose intolerance, as well as the fats in milk. Now those dairy fats, there's a little bit of controversy, so let's explore whether they actually impair or promote our health. Milk straight from the cow is between 85 and 87% water, 5% carbohydrate, between 2.9 and 3.5% protein, and between 3.8 and 5.5% fat. Now, a lot of that variability has to do with differences between individual cows, but it's also breed dependent. So, for example, a Jersey cow has a much higher fat content in their milk than does a Holstein cow. When I was doing research to record this video, I had a wonderful opportunity to talk to a dairy farmer. His name is Angus McKinnon from Quaticook, Quebec. And he told me that most of his cows are Holstein cows. And in fact, if you go through all of North America, about 90% of dairy cows are Holsteins. Holstein's ancestors came from Germany, the north of Germany actually, and the Netherlands, but the first Holstein arrived in America in the year 1631. Did you know that you can recognize those Holstein cows by the black and white markings? What's really, really cool is that apparently, just like snowflakes, no two patterns are exactly the same. Anyway, Holsteins are the preferred cow for dairy farmers, like my friend Angus. And the reason for that is because dairy farming has really tight margins. But Holsteins are known to be the biggest producers of milk. In fact, one Holstein cow can produce up to 9 gallons of milk per day. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans, published by the United States Department of Agriculture and the United States Department of Health and Human Services, recommend that Americans consume between 2 and 3 cups daily of milk and dairy products. This doesn't include cream, sour cream, or cream cheese because they've determined that these products don't contain enough calcium. In those 3 cups of milk, you will be consuming approximately 25 grams each of lactose and protein, and between 20 and 40 grams of fat, depending of course on how much fat is in the dairy product you choose to consume. Now, they're still recommending low-fat dairy, so depending on how well you follow their guidelines, your mileage will vary. Okay, let's talk about the carbs first. Dairy sugar is called lactose, and it's made up of 1 molecule of glucose bound to 1 molecule of galactose. Now, neither of these simple sugars is particularly sweet, so milk doesn't taste sweet. The reason that table sugars taste sweet is because it's made up of 1 molecule of glucose bound to 1 molecule of fructose, and that fructose is what gives it that sweet taste. Of course, like I said, in dairy sugar, it's lactose, which is not sweet because there's no fructose. For sure, we all worry about that glucose from a metabolic perspective because that glucose is what raises our blood sugar. So certainly dairy sugars have the potential to raise our blood sugar. However, I urge you to test for yourself because many of us are much less sensitive to the glucose from dairy than we are from other sources, particularly if you're having that full fat version. And fermented dairy like kefir and yogurt have a much lower sugar content, so people tolerate those a little bit better in terms of your blood sugar. Of course, the biggest issue that most people are concerned about in terms of the carbohydrates in dairy is lactose intolerance. Unlike a true milk allergy, lactose intolerance doesn't damage the intestinal mucosa. But hey, it's unpleasant, I get it. The symptoms of lactose intolerance arise when a person doesn't produce the enzyme called lactase. Lactase is what breaks that bond between the glucose and the galactose so that they can be absorbed. When there isn't lactose present to do that, the lactose remains in the gut and begins to ferment, causing gassiness and cramping. So infants produce lactase in order to absorb their mother's milk. But as they are weaned, many people stop making the lactase enzyme. Some reports suggest that up to 70% of the world's population have lactase insufficiency, although even then, some of those people may tolerate some dairy products. And there's some evidence that the lactase enzyme can be upregulated through gradual increased consumption of these products, either just simply by upregulation of an enzyme that's needed or by adaptations of the microbial populations. Of course, if lactose intolerance is an issue for you, you can supplement with lactase enzyme pills, or you may tolerate goat's milk, which is lower in lactose, or, as I mentioned before, you may be able to tolerate some fermented dairy like the kefir or the yogurt. Something that I find really interesting is that I have several patients who, although they can't tolerate liquid dairy, they're fine with cheese. And the reason for that is because most of the lactose from dairy is present in the whey fraction. All right, but we don't use the whey fraction to make cheese, we use the casein fraction to make cheese. So that's why cheese is actually low in lactose. So many people, even who are lactose intolerant, can eat cheese. There's one important exception though, and that's ricotta cheese, because ricotta is made from that whey section, so it's going to have a higher lactose percentage. So if you're lactose intolerant, ricotta will be a problem for you. All right, talking about curds and whey brings us to milk proteins. Milk allergies are usually caused by something called beta-lactoglobulin. It's not present in human milk, but it is present in cow's milk. It's also present in goat's milk, but it has a slightly different genetic sequence, making it less allergenic, which is why some people with milk allergies can tolerate goat's milk. Cow milk allergy is one of the most common allergies in childhood, although it's interesting to know that most children outgrow it by the age of 5. Now, if you have a milk allergy, please don't experiment based on this video. Please, please, I'm not a doctor and this is not medical advice. All right, back to the caseins. Now remember, casein is the fraction of the protein that we make cheese from. It's also the most dominant fraction of protein in milk. It's about 78% of the total protein content. Caseins precipitate in acid. Now, of course, we use this to our advantage to make cheese, but in some people it can cause those curds in the acidic environment of our gut, making it difficult to absorb. On the other hand, the protein in cow's milk is considered to be very high quality, meaning that it has a really good balance of all of the essential amino acids. So if you tolerate it well, you might consider including dairy products in your meal plan. A minor protein in milk is insulin-like growth factor, or IGF. Its most important job is to promote cell growth, which of course is how it got its name. And also, like its name suggests, it has very similar action to insulin, it's just not quite as powerful. Now, there are claims that it slows aging and boosts athletic performance, both by helping build and maintain muscle mass and bone mass. On the other hand, high levels of IGF have been associated with the development of certain types of cancer and decreased lifespan. Like so many things in life, there seem to be a lot of pros and cons amid a lot of scientific uncertainty. Something you may not know is that a pretty significant portion of the pooled milk supply actually comes from pregnant cows who naturally will be producing more IGF than a non-pregnant cow. So it would seem to be a pretty reasonable concern that people might have as it relates to the quantity of IGF in their milk, because it might stimulate undesired growth, be it increased girth or cancer. And to add to the frustration, there are conflicting reports in the literature about how much of that IGF we actually absorb through our gut. So, I mean, it's a crapshoot. Who really knows? What I will tell you is that I have found that the greatest promoter of increased IGF are actually resistance training and HIIT workouts, which presumably would lead to the type of growth that is desirable. Whey protein at about 17% of total milk protein content is interesting because it's associated with enhancement of our immune system. And some reports suggest that it plays a role in satiety and weight management. It's worth noting that whey is a really big player in human nutrition, especially for infants, because of its role in the development of the gut. Now, alpha-lactalbumin is the most dominant of the whey proteins. Remember before I talked about beta-lactalbumin and how it was the root cause of milk allergies for some people? Well, alpha-lactalbumin is not implicated in allergies. However, it is important in the production of lactase. Now, remember that lactase is the enzyme that breaks down lactose so that we can absorb it. So it's almost as if drinking milk enhances our ability to absorb it. And if that wasn't enough good news, it's also thought to have beneficial effects on sleep, mood, and cognition because of the role it plays in boosting our serotonin levels. I don't know, but maybe your mom was right when she recommended a glass of warm milk before bed. So, moving on from whey proteins, we find ourselves diving into a topic you've probably heard of before, and that's A1 versus A2 milk. Okay, hold on, we're going to get a little sciencey here for a minute, but I really want you to understand the differences because A2 milk is harder to find and will cost you more, so you should really have a good understanding and know what you're getting if you decide to buy it. Okay, recall that caseins are proteins that solidify in the presence of acid. If you think of Little Miss Muffet eating her curds and whey, that whey is the liquid portion, and the casein forms the curds that we can later turn into cheese. Actually, there are three types of caseins. There's alpha, beta, and kappa. The most common one is the alpha, and the least common one is the kappa. The one that I want to focus on right now is the beta casein. 1 liter of milk contains between 9 and 12 grams, or about 2 teaspoons. And 1 liter is just a little bit more than those 3 cups recommended by the dietary guidelines. Okay, I know that you're all really smart here, so you know that proteins are strings of amino acids. Well, beta casein is a string of 209 amino acids. And somewhere around 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, when cattle were brought north into Europe, a single mutation occurred in one of these amino acids. Specifically, the amino acid proline at position 67 suddenly became a histidine. This change meant that suddenly that bond between amino acid 67 and 68 became a lot weaker, and so it broke easily. The result is that during digestion, a 7 amino acid sequence can occur in that mutated A1 casein that does not occur in the original A2 casein sequence. This 7 amino acid sequence is called beta-casomorphin 7, or BCM7. If that sounds kind of like morphine to you, it's because it is kind of like morphine. It has opioid properties, and this was first reported all the way back in 1979 by German scientists. In fact, in animal studies, when rats were fed BCM7, the narcotic effects could be blocked by naloxone, which also blocks morphine. You may be more familiar with the word Narcan. Anecdotally, I sometimes hear that patients report constipation from consuming dairy products. And compared to breast milk-fed babies, those on formula more frequently get constipated. Well, opioids, like morphine, slow the passage of material through the gut. In other words, cause constipation. Constipation is a well-known effect of opioid consumption. So maybe it isn't dairy per se, but rather that A1 milk, or more specifically, the BCM7 that's causing that constipation. I'm not a big fan of epidemiology, but it's a good place to look for trends and associations that warrant further investigation. Several of these types of studies suggest associations between A1 milk consumption and increased rates of heart disease. Countries that consume A2 milk, like France, Switzerland, Kenya, and some Mediterranean countries, have lower rates of heart disease than countries that consume more A1 milk, such as Finland, the UK, and Ireland. Canada, the United States, and Iceland lie somewhere in between. Rates of type 1 diabetes, autism, schizophrenia, and autoimmune diseases are also higher in countries that report consuming more A1 milk. As yet, we don't understand any of the mechanisms by which this could be occurring, so I really urge caution. There could be so many other factors at play here, but I will tell you that it scares me enough that I have my milk-drinking kids switch to A2. All right? When I go to the grocery store, it's easy enough to find A2 milk. I can also sometimes find A2 yogurt. Now, I don't ever see A2 cream or cheese. However, the cream doesn't have very much of the protein portion, so I don't really worry about my morning cup of coffee. And there's some evidence that perhaps the BCM7 in cheese is not such a big deal. I don't really know, but I think the biggest thing is that if you have a leaky gut, you may be absorbing more of that BCM7 than someone who has an intact intestinal mucosa. So if this describes your current state of health, you might want to heal first before you rely on milk. I had an interesting conversation with Angus, my dairy farmer friend. He has a farming acquaintance who only raises A2 milk-producing cows and sells it privately. Now, his customers had believed that they were allergic or intolerant to milk, but now they're consuming his A2 milk and they don't have any issues. Angus has done genotyping on his herd so that he can determine how many of his cows are A2, but his milk is pooled with the milk from other local farms, so there's really no advantage to him to turn over his herd. But he reassures me that the local farmers are very aware of this issue, and some of them are beginning to convert. They estimate that it takes about 2 generations or 7 to 10 years to fully change over from A1 cows to A2 cows on the farm. Okay, the last macronutrient to review is fat. I'll go into more detail in my next video on dairy production, but Angus told me that after all the milk is collected from dairy farmers, it's pooled and then all the fat is removed. Now keep in mind, as I mentioned at the beginning, that on average milk straight from the cow is 4.7% fat. But you won't find that kind of milk in the dairy case at your grocery store, will you? No, the reason is because after separation, they add the fat back to make the versions we're all familiar with. Skim milk, 1%, 2%, and 3.25%, which of course they call whole milk, but now you know better. It's not really whole milk, is it? Well, anyone can see that there's extra fat left over, and this is used for the cream, and yes, ice cream, which of course is much more profitable than milk, especially for the processors, not so much for the farmers. I won't go into detail about any of the micronutrients in milk today, but it is a good source of fat-soluble vitamins. Fat-soluble means that we need to consume them with dietary fat in order to absorb them. So drinking skim milk robs your body of the ability to get these vitamins. Over the last 40 years, diets with lower saturated fats have been recommended to decrease cholesterol levels and the supposed subsequent risk of heart disease, obesity, and related metabolic disorders. Well, unless you just crawled out from under a rock, you know how well that's worked out. Despite a 4-fold drop in whole milk intake, global prevalence of obesity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and fatty liver has increased. Okay, I hear your protests out there, and I agree that we probably can't lay all the blame for all of these chronic conditions on changes in the fat in our milk. But you might be interested to know that an 18-year-long study in 2020, including over 25,000 individuals, demonstrated that children who consume full-fat milk have a lower risk of obesity. Other studies have shown reduced risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. In fact, I'll bet that most people don't know, but even the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee in 2010 acknowledged that association of reduced rates of diabetes in dairy consumers. It's long, but there's an FAO white paper on milk that's pretty interesting reading as far as dairy fat is concerned. I'd be willing to bet that the people telling you to consume low-fat dairy have not actually read what these committees found about the impressive benefits of full-fat dairy. All right, let's break down fat composition even further. First, though, let's review fats in general. A fat is a chain of connected carbon molecules, and in milk, they range in length from 2 carbons to 18. If all of the carbons are surrounded by hydrogen molecules, then there are no double bonds, and we call these saturated fats. They're solid at room temperature, and they provide a stiffness to our cell walls, which is a good thing. If there's one double bond in the carbon chain, then this is called a monounsaturated fat, or MUFA. A good example is olive oil. This double bond creates a kink, which provides less stiffness because the chain can't pack as tightly next to its neighbor. Polyunsaturated fats, or PUFAs, contain 2 or more double bonds and so have even more kinks. An example would be an omega-3 fatty acid. We find these especially in cold water fish who need that fluidity that these PUFAs provide to the cell walls. But having too much of this type of fat in a human cell wall makes them soft and reduces their integrity. Typical milk fat from a dairy cow is approximately 5% PUFA, 25% monounsaturated fat, and 70% saturated fat. A thorough analysis by Fortna in 2019 provides us with a complete breakdown of all of the different fats found in milk. A significant number are short and medium chain fatty acids, meaning they have between 2 and 12 carbons. This is noteworthy because these types of fats don't need to be emulsified with bile salts, and they are instead absorbed directly from the small intestine to the liver, where they're rapidly converted into ketone bodies, providing us with quick energy. These fats also have antimicrobial, anti-tumor, and immune system supporting properties, especially the 12-carbon lauric acid. Did you know that lauric acid is actually not found in any other animal fats? So you're not getting it if you're a carnivore who doesn't consume dairy. Another nutrient found in the fat of grass-fed ruminants is conjugated linoleic acid, or CLA, which in recent years has been shown to play an important role in disease protection and the maintenance of optimal health. It's also credited with having anti-cancer properties, and some studies have shown it has muscle-building and fat-burning properties. Non-fat dairy products don't contain any CLA, and grain-fed cows contain significantly less CLA than grass-fed cows. So if you want to boost your CLA intake, you need to find grass-fed, full-fat milk. I'd be remiss here if I didn't mention trans fats. Remember when I told you that a double bond between 2 carbons creates a kink? Well, that kink can bend one way, or it can bend the opposite way. For simplicity, let's call it trans fat when it bends the opposite way. Now, it's true that there are ruminant trans fatty acids found naturally in dairy and in meat products, but those are structurally a little bit different from the trans fats created through industrial processing. There's a fat called vaccinic acid, and that's the main trans fat found in milk fat, but we actually convert it to CLA. I mean, how cool is that? It's definitely not something we can do with the industrial trans fat seed oils. All right, I hope you're still with me. The last topic I want to discuss is something called odd-chain saturated fatty acids. Most dairy fatty acids have an even number of carbons, which works really well because they're broken down in 2 carbon units to create energy. However, these odd-numbered chains are present in trace amounts in dairy fat, as well as some fish and plants. The higher circulating concentrations of pentadecanoic acid with 15 carbons and heptadecanoic acid with 17 carbons are associated with lower risks of cardiometabolic disease, and a higher intake is associated with lower mortality. C15 decreases inflammation, anemia, dyslipidemia, and fibrosis, potentially by binding to key metabolic regulators and repairing mitochondrial function. In fact, some labs even use C15 and C17 as biomarkers to assess risk for coronary heart disease and type 2 diabetes. Wow, guys, we covered a lot of ground here. I really appreciate you hanging with me as we explore the nitty-gritty of milk macronutrients. My bias is that I believe dairy products are a healthy and delicious addition to a real whole food eating plan. I'll cover pasteurization in my next video, but in the meantime, I urge you to seek out grass-fed, full-fat A2 dairy as much as possible in order to get the maximum nutritional benefit. Although if you're like me and don't drink milk and are instead consuming butter, cream, and cheese, then A2 may be less important for you. However, there does seem to be a nutritional bonus if you can find grass-fed dairy, and of course, full fat is essential. Thanks for listening.